Greetings, podcast world, and welcome back to Bitcoin Magazine's Weekly Bits podcast, a recap and analysis of the most impactful stories directly from the Bitcoin Magazine newsroom. As always, I'm Peter Chawaga, Senior Editor at Bitcoin Magazine, and for this episode, I am joined by David Hollerith. You may recognize David as the host of the Bitcoin Magazine podcast interview series. He also does a lot of behind-the-scenes work for the other Let's Talk Bitcoin podcasts, including this one. And he's written for BitcoinMagazine.com and our company's print magazines for years. David, did I miss anything in that intro?
No, I think that's about it.
Awesome. Well, David, I've asked you to join me this week because of the awesome job you did with our current cover story. It's on the homepage right now. It's titled, Darknet Markets Can't Live With or Without Bitcoin. First of all, I was hoping you could remind me what inspired you to pursue this story in the first place.
Yeah, so I think back in August, I talked to Isabella Begueros, who's the head executive director of the Tor project. And before that, I didn't really know much about Tor other than that was sort of like a browser people could use for anonymity and to access darknet markets. I got really interested just learning about how like Tor was created. It's a very weird thing. It was made in the Naval Research Lab and has this like really funky history. And so I started kind of relearning darknet markets a little bit more from that angle, as opposed to just sort of what you read about them, I guess, like, you know, in any kind of big media publication. And so I have gotten in touch with a few people who cover it regularly, and I'm trying to do a podcast series about darknet markets when we have time. But so, yeah, when the news of the story came out, I just immediately jumped on it as a great opportunity to sort of like learn about how these cases work.
And the news of this story being that the U.S. Department of Justice announced that it took down a darknet market called Welcome to Video, or WTV, and its crackdown on that market was aided by some chain analysis research that traced Bitcoin transactions back to the operator of that market. Is that a fair synopsis?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I guess the thing about it is that these investigations take like a lot of different techniques, and you know it's very easy for people who are pro chain analysis, like helping get rid of illicit use for Bitcoin. It's easy for people like that to sort of jump with this and say, "Oh my God, they did it!" But they assisted, I guess, more in a supporting role. They gave data.
But then, kind of beyond that, like this was the breaking news. WTV got taken down. I think that the other kind of thrust of the article is that kind of using that WTV lens, you're reporting that darknet markets rely on Bitcoin because it's the most popular cryptocurrency that their customers want to use. But because of the Bitcoin blockchain's immutable nature, this reliance on Bitcoin, actually can be the downfall of the operators if it kind of catches up to them from a regulatory standpoint. And sort of that was the reason the headline is more general than this happened to WTV thing, because I think, you really do dive into that more general landscape.
Yeah, I mean, there's like a lot to unpack here, but I guess the thing I'd start off with saying is that darknet markets, everything on Tor that has like a .onion URL is, it's an anonymous marketplace. So these marketplaces work heavily off of Austrian economics, which is just essentially just free market, because most people don't know each other. It's interesting. There's actually like systems of trust that are built in place, and you wonder like how could they do that in an anonymous marketplace? But it's kind of innovative in a way. With all that being said, something like Bitcoin transactions just automatically presents a way for these people who are doing anonymous e-commerce to be tracked in some way. And yeah, in this case, that's sort of what led them back to the admin for Welcome to Video. Yeah, it definitely like brings up like a larger kind of system, which is if people like Bitcoin is not private, so why are people using it for things that they could get busted for? And the problem is that back to the market demand, how the anonymous markets work, they have to work with what the market demands. And Bitcoin has been the easiest way to buy and sell anything on the dark web, and Silk Road is probably what's made that, sort of cemented that. So it's very difficult to change to another payment, especially something like the privacy coins like Monero that are just harder to acquire, harder to implement into like a payment system on the websites. So there's really not a lot of business drive to change to Bitcoin, even though from a transparency perspective, it could put them in jeopardy.
So you have some history covering Darknet markets for us and Tor. You mentioned you're wanting to work on a Darknet podcast series. Just from chatting around the office, I know it's a kind of just a personal interest of yours. So covering this story, is there anything kind of you learned about the Darknet market landscape in general, or use of Tor, or something that sort of like informed your general outlook on, I guess, that side of the internet?
Yeah, I mean, I think like there's like obviously Snowden's leak is a big one of like people sort of paying attention to that. Snowden was a huge Tor advocate. And then like if you come at this from a few other angles, like I think pretty inarguable at this point that a lot of the rest of the internet is fucked up in how it runs. And that has a lot to do with online advertising. It might be something that's just inevitable, but these big tech companies are under a lot of flack, especially Facebook, for, you know, essentially monetizing data. That's how they're making so much money. And Tor, the dark web, they're anonymous markets or an anonymous relay over the internet. That creates a huge opportunity for people to be more private as internet users. The funny side of it, too, is that, you know, there's all this criminal activity, which, like, if you take it piece by piece, some of it, you know, definitely has debate about whether or not it should be considered legal or illegal. Some of it is very much legal in other countries and then illegal in other countries, if we're talking about freedom of speech and also drugs. What's interesting about this Welcome to Video case is that it brings up child pornography, which is one of those indisputable cases where, you know, I've never seen a logical argument for how that would actually like be an acceptable thing. You know, I know some people who are into like radically free markets might accept that. It's something I can't. But it comes in at an interesting time just in this debate because it sort of goes back to this idea of like sort of like the Austrian, maybe libertarian economic viewpoint, which is that, you know, we should be able to protect our rights no matter what. And then this is a scenario where rights do literally infringe on other people's rights. It's a very interesting level of complexity to add to sort of like understanding this stuff.
Yeah, I think that probably goes a long way in answering the next question I wanted to ask you. But that is one kind of dichotomy we talked about when you were first thinking about writing this article. My first instinct editorially was whenever we cover darknet markets, you know, the audience seems to really be interested in those stories, and the general kind of anecdotal feedback I get from our coverage is that Bitcoiners are pro darknet markets and, as you say, kind of Austrian and anti-censorship, but then nobody can really reasonably defend what WTV was a marketplace for. That was something I think you articulated when you were first working on this story. Like, okay, Peter, I hear that our audience likes darknet markets, but with WTV, there's no way I can put that in like a favorable light, which is really understandable. As you worked on the story, did you kind of see any kind of nuance there, or did that just sort of affirm your instinct that as much as Bitcoiners and like darknet markets are important for freedom, in this case, the DOJ did a good job?
I think like one thing with Tor and the dark web in general is that like legal and illegal essentially goes out the window because everything's anonymous. So it's really just whether or not it can be traced. Depending on who you're talking to, they're obviously going to disagree with that. But I think that is the reality, is it's sort of like a place that doesn't really have to deal with the same kind of legal structures on the rest of the internet. So like when you're considering something like this kind of content and whether or not it's like a good or bad thing, that's definitely, obviously I think I came in and I was like, this is a good thing that this was taken down. But in general, it doesn't really matter because it's more of what we're doing at Bitcoin Magazine is looking at it from an economic perspective. So, at any time you might sound like you're covering the case from the point of view of the investigators or from the point of view of the hackers, in this case, the Darknet market admins. You kind of have to look at every angle too and sort of understand it in some way. Like the administrator of this website, he was like a 23-year-old South Korean. And what's sort of interesting about that is that, like, if you actually consider it, like, he had more than likely zero interest in the content he was producing. He was doing this as a way to make money. And that's what these are, is opportunities for people to make money in a lot of ways, at least the people who are directly involved. That's like a really strange thing to think about, especially when you consider sort of how everything becomes a little bit less difficult to deal with from like a moral perspective when things are happening in an anonymous marketplace. It's a lot easier to write things off.
Yeah, and I always think back to whenever we cover, the Darknet, kind of think back to the godfather of the Darknet and Bitcoin's relationship to it, and Silk Road and Ross Ulbricht. And, the general sentiment I feel in the space is that Ross's sentencing was much too severe, that the Silk Road was a great freedom project, important marketplace, and that kind of ties into a lot of the philosophy and ethos of Bitcoin. But just from my personal standpoint, I don't totally align with that completely positive outlook on Silk Road. So I think it's good to have a nuanced debate. I think you covered it from a very objective angle. I mean, I think you put it really well. Like, it's really not about whether we agree with it. It's not really a question of right or wrong. Bitcoin is sort of, we cover it from kind of like a technology standpoint and an economic standpoint. And, but it can be hard to kind of avoid the morality issue, even as an objective reporter, I feel like.
Totally. And it's really fascinating too. Like in this space, people, a lot of times when they're talking about darknet markets, they'll say from an academic point of view or from a non-academic point of view, which like I still don't really understand what that means. Basically, an academic point of view means you're just not even bringing in like the question of whether or not you think it's like right or wrong to bear, and you're just sort of like analyzing it. And so like if you take that perspective from an academic point of view, like a lot of this is so fascinating. Like the dark web Ross is a great example. That's where you see a lot of like the innovation that shows up on the rest of the internet. Like Silk Road was basically like an Amazon, eBay type scenario, except it was completely anonymous. And there's so many cool things that come out of that. Like, I mean, even if you just look at the point of view of discrimination, like people can't be discriminated unless they have like a really bad reputation, That is kind of interesting. And then the other side of this too is that Chainalysis is sort of like, they're sort of like the people who brought down this bad market. And they're a pretty controversial figure in the space too, for the fact that, they are essentially collecting data and giving it to law enforcement about cryptocurrency businesses. They basically tell law enforcement which exchanges have the information they need, and then law enforcement just subpoenas them.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. My impressions just reading the article are basically any time what we cover, interview, Chainalysis, not that they should be, but they're really unapologetic about, yes, we're tracking transactions. Yes, we're handing over this, like forensic transaction information to lawmakers and, federal agencies. And like they are in no way trying to twist it towards the Bitcoin ethos of like complete freedom and this idea that, we're beyond regulation or anything like that. And frankly, I think that's great for them to play that role. But it makes me think, I think one thing like that the space asks for all the time is not like freedom from regulation, but proper regulation. I think I hear more often than I hear regulators should butt out. I hear like we want to work with regulators because they clearly don't understand Bitcoin, blockchain, cryptocurrency, and their regulations are kind of off base. And then so I feel like a firm like Chainalysis might be a good, they're clearly very technically savvy. Clearly, like and I'm doing air quotes here, get it as far as what a blockchain is, how Bitcoin works, what's powerful about it, what its shortcomings and flaws are. And they could be an interesting bridge, I guess, between regulators and like the actual active blockchain Bitcoin community.
Yeah, definitely. What I think I'm seeing here too is that, there used to be, I feel like a lot of talk about just blockchain technology is sort of like gone away. People are much more interested in cryptocurrency, us, Bitcoin. But even since that's happened, people are basically looking at cryptocurrency or blockchain technology in general, and they're saying either this is like a tool for freedom for the individuals, like financial freedom in some way, or it's a tool for transparency. And transparency has a lot of great benefits, but the one added thing is that in a lot of ways, it will likely result into a big power consolidation to whoever can like build a blockchain or control a blockchain, has the money for the data. So that could likely be a government entity or some sort of corporation. And if something like that happens, basically all of this new tech in this space becomes the old tech that we're dealing with now that has the same kind of problems that we're seeing with like Facebook and Google. So like that's definitely interesting. But then like as a whole, if you're looking at this sector, they are a great example of a company that's doing really well. They're growing a ton. With all the news about China, like their services are definitely going to be used in Asia Pacific markets more. So it is kind of strange because it depends on which level you're looking at about what you take, but they're definitely a company to keep an eye on because they're the, sort of the strongest authority that exists in the space. They're the only one that's doing it. So
yeah, I think that would make a very cool Bitcoin Magazine article, sort of a feature profile on Chainalysis, who works there, what they do, and what the future of if hyper Bitcoinization, hyper blockchain society comes to fruition. Why is Chainalysis kind of, in what direction are they poised to grow? The last question I had here, I did want to dive back into the editorial process for this piece just one more time. I think one thing, not debate, but conversation we were having was, and I alluded to this earlier, is this story a WTV got shut down and here's how, kind of like breaking news story, or is this a what does Bitcoin mean for the Darknet marketplace at large kind of feature story? Obviously, if you go to the site, you can see pretty straight away that we went the more feature route. But did that editorial question come into your reporting at all? Or did you go ahead and cover it sort of as that breaking WTV type story and it just sort of evolved and all this extra coverage just naturally like came into it?
So the news that got me on the story was WTV, and that investigation was like a quick way to get into what was going on. As it evolved, though, it definitely turned out to be more about like the darknet in general. And I think right now, just with the work I'm doing, I kind of want to like look at and point at like the dark web as much as possible, just because I think it's like a really interesting place that is very misunderstood and continues to be an issue on like a weekly basis. What I love about it is it's so difficult to find people who actually are experts with it, so that when you do, you can weirdly kind of trust them even though you really can't know them.
Yeah, I did want to ask about that too. So in addition to interviewing a representative of Chainalysis, you talked to Caleb, and he's on Twitter at 5auth, AUTH.
Yeah.
So you kind of describe him in the article as a crypto and drug market researcher, point out that
Not
he's
non-academic.
non-academic. Yeah, very clear about that. But how did you, find Caleb? And is there any more detail you can give about, why he's an authority, or how you found him in the first place, or why you trust him as a source about darknet markets?
So Kyle Torpy actually was the guy who turned me on to him. And I talked with Caleb, and the first time I talked to him, I interviewed him on a podcast. He was using a VPN, so his voice was like really distorted and it would like skip. And I was like, I don't know who I am talking to. And I went back to Kyle, and Kyle connected me to a few other people, and I started to see that these other people I was talking to, who were real people, were actually academics. They were like sociologists, like internet sociologist is like a thing now that is like actually like pretty viable, which is funny. Sociologists suddenly have like definitely a job market. But so they all seem to vet Caleb and talk about him regularly, but I still don't know a ton about him. And every time I'll ask him a question that veers to like he just can't talk about, he won't go there. So he's a Darknet source through and through.
Yeah, and I would say, and I mean this totally in a positive way, almost any other serious newsroom, that kind of sketchiness or inability to verify identity would be kind of some like red flags around using this person as a source. But what's really cool about our newsroom being a leader in the space, being kind of original to the space and designed for decentralized world, the Bitcoin focused and even Darknet focused, community, is that kind of, I think we value some of that stuff. And if anything, the way you described finding him actually kind of adds authority, or that's a source we're willing to use to protect his identity and all of that. And I think it really informs our stories a lot better than a more traditional newsroom that wouldn't be comfortable. I think going that route in some cases would have a worse story as a result. So good job finding him for sure. And like, that's really interesting. Maybe you'll have to get him on a podcast, or definitely, keep him as a great source for these kind of stories.
Yeah, he's been great, and he's a ton of information about it. And I keep asking him if he wants me to quote him on this stuff. And he's fine with it because he does a lot of tweets. He's got like way more followers than I do on Twitter. But he's been great.
Cool. Awesome. Well, David, thanks again for coming in, discussing that story. Listeners, you can find that on our homepage. Is there anything else I didn't ask about that you wanted to make sure listeners knew?
I guess the one thing we didn't touch on was just coin mixing or coin joins is sort of like the spot in this issue of Bitcoin being Bitcoin transactions being transparent or private. Coin mixing is sort of like the undecided factor. If you do it right, you will remain private, or you can hide your transaction trail. And if you do it wrong, you won't. So there have been both cases of that. So
yeah, coin mixing probably needs its whole own episode, to be honest. But awesome. Glad you brought that up, and thanks again for coming in.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That does it for another episode of Bitcoin Magazine's Weekly Bits podcast, a BTC media podcast on the Let's Talk Bitcoin network. It was produced and edited by Graham Peterson and my lovely guest for today, David Hollerith. If you're interested in reading the story we discussed or others like it, check out our homepage at bitcoinmagazine.com and follow us on Twitter at Bitcoin Magazine. You can find more engaging crypto podcasts over at letstalkbitcoin.com and can follow them on Twitter at the LTB Network for all of the latest episodes. Be sure to subscribe to the show on the Apple Podcast app, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts, and to leave us a review. Finally, I want to remind listeners about the upcoming Bitcoin 2020 conference being held in San Francisco from March 27 to 28 next year. It's already shaping up to be the biggest Bitcoin conference ever, and I know there's a ton more to announce. You can learn more at bitcoin2020conference.com.